Today's class is about education. In a way, the introductory terms is, do I have to do everything myself? Can I learn to pass things over to others? But as we continue on with the content of the class, we find its relevance and how strong it is to education. You are possibly wondering, what is the relevance of education to our parsha? That we'll see in source number 1. But in the meanwhile, we've got to understand where does mandatory education begin? So I ask you, fellow historians, who was the first person in modern history to mandate that every child go to school? It was King Fredrick of Prussia, Prussia. King Fredrick of Prussia in year 1717 announces that every child must go get an education, must begin schooling, and that's an obligation. Following King Frederick comes whoever was leading France at the time, about 100 years later. And then in America, when did America mandate mandatory education for every single person? Only in the late 19th century. And remember, we're the nation of the free, right? So maybe you don't have to get an education to be free. That we'll discuss another time. In the meanwhile, who started mandatory education amongst the Jewish people? Is there a Jewish obligation to educate your next generation? Is there an obligation to educate someone who's not related to you? All of that and just a bit more in today's conversation. So what we'll do straight away, we'll start with source number 1. And does everybody have a source sheet? I hope so. The link is in the email. Let's go straight away with Professor Blumenthal. Please read for us a pasuk in Chumash. This is a verse in the Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 19. It is this verse that introduces our class. Reb Shmuel.
Go. You should teach them to your children, to speak of them when you sit in your house, when you go on your way, when you lie down, and when you rise.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So now let's find out what public education looks like in ancient Israel. And we'll call Alan. Can you please read for us source 2? Go from the beginning to the end. Off you go.
Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of, Rav truly, that person is remembered for good. Yehoshua ben Gamla is his name. If not for him, the Torah would have been forgotten from Israel. Initially, whoever had a father would learn Torah from him, and whoever did not would not learn Torah at all. Based on what verse did they do so? They interpreted the verse, you should teach them to your children, to mean you yourselves should teach. Then they instituted that schools be established in Jerusalem. Based on what verse? For Torah emerges from Zion, but still whoever had a father, the father would bring him to Jerusalem to study. But whoever did not have a father didn't go. Then they instituted that schools be established in every region, and students would be enrolled at age 16 or 17. However, if a teacher grew angry at a student, he would rebel and leave. This state of affairs continued until Yehoshua ben Gamla came and instituted that schools be established in every province and in every town, and children would be enrolled at age 6 or 7.
Thank you, Alan. So what have we got? There is a fellow, his name is Yehoshua ben Gamla. He is remembered as a high priest. In addition, he was a member of the High Court in Jerusalem. And this was all during the period right before the destruction of the Holy Temple. How did such a fellow become the high priest? You'd be surprised to know that he bribed his way in. He paid for the position. But nevertheless, the Talmud says about this fellow, and for the following reason, If not for him, the Torah would have been forgotten from Israel. What did he do? So we go through all of the different stages in education in our history. First, it was just if a person had a child, they taught their child. If a child had a parent, had a father, the father taught the child. From there, it continued on. Sometimes there was children without fathers. Sometimes the fathers were not capable of teaching, so they had to do something else. So they started a school in Jerusalem. But what happened then was that everybody who had an interest in education sent their kids off to school in Jerusalem. Like it says, the Torah emerges from Zion. But not everybody was doing it. So then they started another program. They said everybody from the age of 16 or 17, go get an education. What do kids do until they're 16 and 17? They'll play, they'll hang out, they'll have fun. But what about the youngest kids? Effectively, what was happening, that the older children, when they came into school, they were already set. If they wanted education, they stayed. If they didn't want education, they put up a fuss. And in all that time, the older kids who were not interested kept on getting lost. So what is so praiseworthy about this guy, about this Yeshua ben Gamla? He was focused on every single child. He didn't want to let anybody go. He said, if someone's going to get stuck at an older age and no one's going to be paying attention to his education, let's start education earlier. Let's get him into school at a younger age. And that's what happens. Let's take a look at what the Rebbe's Sikha is. Let's call on Juan. Will you read for us the first piece of the Sikha, please?
The Talmud states that Yeshua ben Gamla is remembering for his good deeds because he instituted that teachers be set up in every single town to teach Torah. If not for him, Torah would have been forgotten. Obviously, he was very deserving of prize. Therefore, mentioned in the Torah, the oral Torah, which will preserve his name for eternity. Keep going.
Please.
The Talmud gives us more details. It's not that Jews did not fulfill the commandment to teach their children until the advent of Yeshua ben Gamla. God forgives to imply such a thing, especially about the temple era, as the Talmud cites the verse, for Torah emerged from Zion. When Yeshua ben Gamla served there as a high priest, fathers indeed taught their children, but those who had no father didn't have the opportunity to learn. This doesn't seem to be a situation in which Torah will be forgotten. One is obligated to teach his children when he is a minor, under bar mitzvah, when he is too young to educate himself. Most children of that age had living fathers, especially during the temple era when God's blessings were more revealed than during times of exile. So the state of affairs, the most part, was that Jewish children were learning Torah for their fathers. Furthermore, the Talmud adds that when the plagues of the orphans became apparent, they appointed teachers in Jerusalem based on the verse, for Torah emerged from Zion, and his school attracted students from all over the land of Israel. If so, there was no reason to assume that Torah was about to be forgotten. The Talmud adds yet more: students would be enrolled at age 16 or 17, apparently to allow the child to be self-sufficient before being served away from home. But as a result, students were also old enough to rebel. Clearly, students were studying Torah long before Joshua ben Gamla. Both children with fathers and children without fathers, because they had the opportunity to go to Jerusalem, with the exception of those who rebelled. It was under those conditions that Joshua ben Gamla instituted that the teachers set up in every region and every city, and that children begin their education at age of 6 or 7 instead of waiting until they were 16 or 17. Nonetheless, the Talmud attributes this enactment to having saved no rebellious student and orphan who don't have anyone to bring them to Jerusalem, but to having saved the entire Torah from being forgotten. This tells us how important it is to educate a child from age 6 or 7. It will impact not only the child and his family and community. It will ensure that Torah is not forgotten from the entire Jewish people.
Thank you, Juan. So the Rebbe points out that the Jewish children were actually learning Torah before this enactment. Either it was their fathers, or it was the central schools, or even it was regional centers. Only a small part of the population was left out. And who are they? Orphans, or children of ignorant parents, and rebellious teenagers. So who is Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla taking care of? Who is he looking after? These three demographics. That's who he's looking for. Nevertheless, the Talmud says about this guy that it's because of him that the Torah was not forgotten. Later on, we'll find that there's only one other person who can say just about himself. It's not the Talmud says it about him. He says it about himself that he saved the world, the Torah, from being forgotten. And so, the Rebbe continues over here. The Rebbe says, Alan, go for it.
Quick question. So before this, before they were sort of centralized education, so you would assume, based on this, that every father was educated in Torah. Was Torah written at that point? Was there a Torah scroll written?
You know what's amazing, Alan, is that you have predicted the next paragraph.
Oh boy.
And I think in reward for using your intellectual abilities, you get to read the next pieces. How much? Yeah, read the until the next break.
Even in a good Jewish home?
Exactly. Go for it.
Moreover, the Alter Rebbe points out in his Laws of Torah study that according to the laws mentioned in the Talmud, a child is inculcated with many elements of Judaism even before he begins to study at age 6 or 7. When he begins to speak at age 2, he is taught to recite the verse of Torah, Tziva, and other verses by heart. At 4 years of age, he is taught the letters to accustom himself to reading Torah. The Alter Rebbe points out that in those days, the Holy Tongue was commonly spoken, and children didn't need to learn the meaning of the words. They needed only to be taught how to read, because the writing in those days was like our Torah scrolls, without vowels. In other words, the Talmud tells us that despite the fact that children were inculcated with Judaism by their parents from age 2. The absence of an organized system of learning from age 6 or 7 place the future of Torah in jeopardy, God forbid.
I'll jump in right here. What did we just discover as an answer to Alan's question? What were the people doing until they turned however old? Well, number one, the kids already spoke the language. It's not like us. When we go to Hebrew school or Cheder, we have to learn Hebrew. We have to learn the letters. We have to learn the vowels, the pronunciation. When they went to school, they were ahead of all of that. They started already understanding the simple language, already being capable of reading largely. So what were kids doing before they turned 16 or 17? They were getting ready. So what did they learn when they were 16 or 17? So now it's we've got to discuss for a second what Jewish study really is. It's only recent in recent Jewish history, and when I say recent, I mean about 2,000 years. It's only recent that we have a written text. We always had the written Torah, the 24 books of the Tanakh, the Torah, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim, the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the writings. And the rest of it was orally transmitted, one teacher to his students, in a classroom setting where one teacher may have had hundreds of students learning from him. Hence, by the way, it says in the Ethics of Our Fathers that one should sit at the feet of their teacher and drink their words like water. Because how else are you going to get a transmission of information if you don't hang around with your teacher like a hand in a glove? How does Torah study look? Well, when the teacher taught, he would review from beginning to end. He would say, here is a pasuk, here is a verse. From this verse, we can derive A, B, C. The application of A is, 1, 2, 3. The application of B will be 4, 5, 6. The application of C will be 7, 8, 9. Once you've reviewed that, and by the way, you have to review that 100 times in order to remember it and be able to use it properly, then you went on to the next lesson. So we were already talking about if a student was studious and was interested, there was a lot of oral tradition to consume. There's a huge amount of information to study. And so Alan asks, what were they doing? I think now we know what they were doing. They might have been preparing for the next step up. But again, these are only the people who are interested. These are only the people who they have what we would call today, they're capable of getting into an Ivy League school, which is either their parents can buy their way in, or they have the brains to earn it. Or maybe it's in the other direction, but it's nevertheless that way. So we're talking about only the best of the best students are achieving these goals. Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla is pushing for everybody's education. So Alan, take it away for the next 2 paragraphs until the next break.
In our day, this is even more important. For a child to study Torah from his father, the father must first study Torah himself. And it's easier to deal with a child than to deal with a father. It is far easier to encourage a child to strengthen his Judaism than to influence someone who is already set in his ways for many years. When the father lacks this awareness, and when the environment is not a Jewish one, and when a child needs to be taught not only vowels, but even the alphabet of Judaism, the need to ensure that Torah not be forgotten is so much greater. We cannot suffice with yeshivas for 16 and 17-year-olds. We cannot rely on the fact that the child's father had a grandfather who observed Torah and its commandments. It is our obligation to be mindful of Yehoshua ben Gamla's enactment, for which he is eternally remembered, that teachers be set up in every region and in every town, even towns Yehoshua ben Gamla never personally visited, due to his role as the high priest who must dwell in Jerusalem. As Maimonides states, Jerusalem already had schools for those who could not learn from their fathers, but he was still motivated to enact a rule which remains in effect until this very day and obligates every single Jewish community to establish schools in every single region and in every single city.
Awesome. So what have we got now? Now we have a new issue that features specifically in 2021, or actually whatever. It's not such a recent problem. It's a regular issue, and that is that yeah, we want the kids to learn, but who's going to teach the kids? We need the parents to teach the kids. But what happens sometimes when the parents themselves don't know? Now what? Who's going to teach the kids next? Therefore, the vital need to make a system to get these kids going at their earliest stage. One of my personal preparations to getting this position of serving the Jewish communities in rural Georgia was being a part of the Released Time program. What is Released Time program? So there is a federal law that any child in public school can get 1 hour a week out of his school day for religious education. It can't be done on school site because on school grounds you can't have church and state mixing together. So we used to take the kids from the public schools, we put them onto a yellow bus, drive them over to the closest synagogue, and teach them Torah for an hour. We'd sing songs, make blessings on food, say Torah psukim that they hopefully will remember. And then at the end of the hour, these kids would be begging for more, but we got to send them home to give them back to their parents. And so we'd be back on the next Wednesday. This was an effort to get those kids who would never otherwise get a Jewish education. We were going to find them and pull them in one by one so that we could get them started, give them something to go with. If you know you're New York, I was positioned at public school 69 and 72 in Staten Island. My father, who's with us here, he was also a teacher of Release Time, but that was in the 70s, and I was there in the 2010s or so, in the teens. Okay, let's go forward. Juan, Robert, will you please continue for us? We are all Yeshua ben Gamla.
Yehoshua ben Gamla's deeds aren't remembered merely as a nice tale. It is a part of the Torah, i.e., it is a directive for our own lives. A person must endeavor to do everything possible to fulfill this enactment in his community and in every city in which he has some form of influence, even a place which he never visited. Now, the Alter Rebbe explained that the commandments of the Torah are written in a form which can be interpreted both as a commandment and as a promise. Indeed, the commandment to teach our children can be interpreted both ways as well. This is only a question of your will. If you truly desire it, God will help you succeed in fulfilling this commandment, not only to teach your own children and not only to teach many other students, but also to carry out the enactment of Yehoshua ben Gamla. In every city where Jews live, investigate whether there is also a Jewish school for children of age 2 to learn the verse of Torah Tziva and then the Aleph Bet. As we said earlier, these need to be inculcated into the child at the earliest possible age. The endeavor to emulate Yehoshua ben Gamla will surely succeed with God's help, and we will merit to be counted among those who are remembered for good for eternity.
Thank you, Professor Blumenthal. So what we've got now, where we're up to, is that this is something that every one of us need to take a stand in. We can't just allow it to be the system, the federation, the institutions taking care of this, because each of us know another Jewish child who is waiting for something. He's waiting to find out just one letter of the Aleph base. In the cliche way to say it, if you know Aleph, teach Aleph. If you know one, teach one. If you know something, share it with the next guy. Historically, it's interesting to note there was a prime minister of Israel whose name was Zalman Shazar, prime minister of Israel. He was the Minister of Education, and later on, Ben-Gurion asked him to become the president of the state. He came from a Chabad family, as it happens, back in Russia, and he was very close with the Rebbe and instrumental in the growth of Chabad in Israel. At the Farbrengen, the gathering where this Sikha was said, Zalman Shazar was present. He was there. Before the gathering, he had an audience with the Rebbe. After the gathering, he had another audience with the Rebbe that lasted 2 hours, which is huge. It was so big that the security personnel who were there were like exhausted and they needed to be changed out. They couldn't handle the length of time and the effort that it took for them to deal with this. Why do I mention that Zalman Shazar was there? Because when he was the Minister of Education, he passed a mandatory education law. He passed a mandatory education law, and in the legislation, he writes that since the days of the Second Temple, there were teachers in every Jewish village. So look at that. Here you have it's possible that the Rebbe chose to speak about this topic at this time, at this gathering, to honor Mr. Shazar, who had been so vital in bringing Jewish education to all the small towns and villages and every single Jewish child in the land of Israel. Right before we move on to section 2, I'd like to open the floor for a couple questions. Anyone have something to ask?
Just
Carla,
so I'm
please.
clear, historically, all of this at this time is still educating Jewish males. Jewish girls were not included.
That is a very good question, especially given our openness nowadays to educating women. We believe in this very strongly. So Carl is asking what happened to education? What happened to their education then? So a brief answer is the system for educating people then was built only for men, simply. Right? And they didn't make an effort, for whatever reason, to teach women. Given as such, since there were no teachers, and Torah has to be taught from a teacher to a student, there was even a level of discouraging the education of women. Then, nowadays, however, things are completely different. Nowadays, there is a huge infrastructure for education for women, especially in the Jewish community, and all the central leadership encourage women to get a Jewish education. Why? There's so much influence in our surroundings that teach us different things that are really antithetical to what Judaism stands for. And if we don't today make sure that every single Jew gets a Jewish education, that every human gets a moral and ethical education, then just the regular influences of the world around us will drag any person all the way down to the bottom of the pit. And so nowadays it is very, very important, and it's encouraged across the entire breadth of the community to make sure that Jewish women are completely educated in all things Jewish. Carla, does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
You are welcome. Okay, let's go on to section B. We are actually going to move into a second sikha, which kind of follows one from the other, two different occasions of the Rebbe's speeches. The previous one was 1973. This one was said in 1977. And this one was said with as part of a conversation with a certain Jewish leader. There is, in Hasidic communities, the leader is called the Rebbe. The Rebbe of Ger which is a community, a Hasidic community in Israel, came to visit our Rebbe. And he asked, and so our Rebbe encouraged him that he should start a kollel, he should start a program for newly married couples to train and go out to small communities and be the stand-in rabbi for a period of time. And at the time, the Rebbe said he has a list of over 100 communities in Israel that are in urgent need of a rabbi. And there wasn't enough, foot soldiers to go and do the work. There wasn't enough people ready to stand up and say, I will do it. As an interesting note, in the same conversation, the Rebbe said that he's aware that the non-religious Israeli community is upset at the religious community that they don't join into the armed services. And so the Rebbe said at the time that if these young men, just married, just out of yeshiva, would go and volunteer for 3 years in a foreign community, then this criticism would kind of die down a bit, because everybody would be volunteering for the betterment of the greater community of Israel at the same age group, at the same time, in the same period. Let's take a look using the Talmud here from Bava Metzia. We'll take a look at an interesting conversation that happens between two Jewish leaders. But first, Reish Lakish, he's a person, was demarcating the burial caves of certain sages. When he arrived at Rabbi Chia's cave, suddenly the exact location of his grave eluded him. So Reish Lakish became distressed, and he calls out in prayer, he says, Master of the universe, did I not analyze the Torah like Rabbi Chia? And so there is a divine voice which responds to him. He comes out and he says, you analyzed the Torah like him, but you did not disseminate the Torah like him. Interesting. And it continues. When Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Chia would debate the Torah, so Rabbi Hanina would say to Rabbi Chia, you debate with me, if heaven forbid the Torah were forgotten from Israel, I would restore it with my power of analysis. To that, Rabbi Chia said back to Rabbi Hanina, he said, you're debating with me. I ensure that the Torah will never be forgotten. So how did Rabbi Chia ensure that the Torah will never be forgotten? This coming paragraph is very important. Pay attention closely. What do? He says, I sow flax seeds. I twine nets with flax. I then hunt deer and feed them meat to orphans. Next, I prepare the parchment from their hides and write the 5 books of the Torah on them. I go to a city and teach 5 children the 5 books, 1 book per child. And I teach 6 children the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And I say to them, until I return, read each other the Torah and teach each other the Mishnah. This is how I act to ensure that the Torah will not be forgotten by the Jewish people. And as a follow-up, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the leader of the Jewish people at that time, said, how great are the deeds of Rabbi Chia. Which is really a fascinating moment over here. So now, some of you might be wondering, how come Rabbi Chia has to go and make this effort to teach Torah to children 1 book at a time, 1 Mishnah at a time? What happened to all the schools? We just said that Yeshua ben Gamla had instituted mandatory education. So you need some historical context. Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla lived before the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Chia lived 150 years later, after the destruction, when at a time when people did not have the emotional or spiritual energy to go out and fend for themselves. No one was starting schools. No one was working on it. And there was only a seldom few that were ready to put their own interests on the line and go ahead and teach. And that's why Rabbi Hanina is recognized for his dissemination of the Torah. like it says in that first paragraph there. I am going to tell you guys a fantastic story which is quoted in the Talmud. This is actually continuing in the Talmud. And it's an amazing story, but what it does is it also illustrates the greatness of Rabbi Chia. We all know about Elijah the prophet. Elijah was often found in the academy of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He was always in his school. One day, it was a Rosh Chodesh, it was the first day of the month. And so Elijah was delayed and he didn't come. He didn't come to the school. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was able to see Elijah the prophet, engage with him, he was like, in a way angelic. This was after his, you can't call it a passing as the prophets tell us, but nevertheless. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, this teacher, says to Elijah, where were you? What's going on? How come you came late? So Elijah responds, I had to wake up Abraham, wash his hands, wait for him to pray, and lay him back down. And then I had to wake up Isaac, wash his hands, and then he has to pray, and then I lay him down. And I had to do that for Jacob too. So now Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, this teacher, he turns and he says to Elijah, why don't you just wake them all up at the same time? Why are you waiting for each one to finish and then start the next one? So Elijah says, I know that if I would wake up all three of them at the same time, they would generate powerful prayers and bring the Mashiach prematurely, and it wouldn't be okay. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he sees an opportunity. So he says to Elijah, maybe there's someone in the world today who's alive and is comparable to them, which means his prayers are strong enough to bring Mashiach just like that. So Elijah says, yeah, Rabbi Chia, this guy that we just spoke about a moment ago, him and his sons, they can do it. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi grabs the opportunity, and together with the other rabbis, he declares a public fast. And he sends an invitation to Rabbi Chia that Rabbi Chia should lead the prayers at this public fast. Rabbi Chia comes and he starts to pray the Amidah. So what's the first blessing? What's one of the first comments in the Amidah? Mashiv Haruach. Mashiv Haruach means the one who makes the wind blow. And as he recites it, the wind begins to blow. Rabbi Chia then says, Morid HaGeshem, the one who makes the rain fall, and immediately the rain begins to fall. And he's about to say, Mechayeh Meisim, the one who revives the dead, which would ultimately herald the bringing of Mashiach. And suddenly the world is shaking. What's happening in heaven? In heaven, they say, who is the revealer of secrets in the world? Who told them that Rabbi Chia has such potency? So they said in response, it was Elijah. So they summon Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi, they bring him up to the holy court, and he's beaten with 60 fiery lashings. Okay? Now Elijah returns to earth, disguised as a bear of fire. And he came amongst the congregation and he distracted them from their prayers. And that stopped Rabbi Chia from continuing with the prayer, he who revives the dead. Take a break. What have we got? We now understand the awesomeness, the greatness of this Rabbi Chia. This Rabbi Chia is so amazing. He's so powerful that had he been able to pray for the temple to be rebuilt, for the revival of the dead, together with all the other Jewish people, it would have been fulfilled. That story is a direct quote from Talmud, Bava Metzia 85b. And now the Rebbe continues. I don't know which page it is in the student guidebook, but let's take a look. So regarding Rabbi Chia's work to spread the Torah, the Talmud says in his name, that he ensured that the Torah would not be forgotten. And it was said at that time, how great are the works of Chia. Remember, this is a response of Rabbi Chia to Hanina. Rabbi Hanina said that he could bring back the entire Torah with his power of analytics. And Rabbi Chia said, how do you argue with me? I make sure that the Torah is not going to be forgotten altogether. Now, we all know that Rabbi Chia was occupied with his own study of the Torah, and he was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was the one who compiled the text of the Mishnah, of the Mishnah and the Brisa. And the Talmud says any Brisa which isn't taught in the study hall of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Oshia, you can't use it as a reference. So that just gives you how that gives you a recognition of how careful they were and how important they are in the recording of the Torah. Nevertheless, this Rabbi Chia, who is so praised and is so potent, he is known and remembered for his own effort to teach the Torah to Jewish children, making sure that the Torah should not be forgotten. So continuing, and let's understand this Rabbi Chia. How much effort did he put in to teach the Torah? And from that, we're going to see how much effort we, as individuals, should put in to pass on the tradition to our next generation. Doing the hunting. Rabbi Chia made the effort to teach young children himself. He didn't suffice with dispatching his students. He had many of them, and he sent them. But that wasn't the only thing he did. But rather, he personally went and hunted deer. Hunting deer to make the parchment to write the 5 books of the Torah on. And he goes through the whole process like we read earlier. So regarding teaching, it makes sense. He wants to teach because he'll teach the best quality. But why does he have to go and hunt? Why does he have to go and get the parchment to write down the Torah? Even though he could have passed it on to his students, he still wants to be the guy, to be the one who's doing all the personal effort to bring in the necessary items, and to be the person who, to show the great and vital importance of educating Jewish children. And so teaching one another on the, what you would call it, maybe it's the last section of the package. When Rabbi Chia taught the children, he immediately instructed them to teach each other. There's actually 2 people that didn't get a chance to read. Let's ask Carla and Diana. You guys can please split this section. Carla, you can do the first 3, and then Diana, you'll do the last 3, please. You guys with me on which page we're on?
So beginning with teaching one another.
Yes, please.
When Rabbi Chia taught the children, he immediately instructed them to teach each other. Each of the 5 students was tasked with teaching his book of the Torah to the others, and each of the 6 was responsible to teach his volume of the Mishnah. In other words, from the very outset of the study, Rabbi Chia taught them to be lamplighters. This was the specialty of Rabbi Chia. He didn't suffice with learning Torah from Rabbi Yehuda and even being the compiler of the Beretas. He personally went to the field to hunt deer for the skin upon which to write the 5 books of the Torah, to teach the children. In this regard, Rabbi Yehuda says, how great are the works of Chia.
Diana, can you read for us?
She's muted.
She's muted, and it doesn't look like she's able to read. Okay,
What
Wait,
page?
wait.
Oh.
There she goes.
here she is.
What page are we on?
We are
Last page, 14.
14.
Okay, no problem. Just a second.
Love it.
From Rabbi Chaya's behavior, we learn about the correct approach to spreading Torah. The Talmud said, you did not disseminate Torah like him, indicating that he is the paragon of someone who spreads Torah. He teaches us to engage with all levels of students, even those on the lowest level. We need to engage even with those who study Torah for all the wrong reasons, unlike those who teach only those who rise in their honor, while ignoring the rest. We need to teach Torah, Chumash, and Mishnah, even to those who had no previous connection to Torah learning. Furthermore, the Hebrew word for disseminating Torah, habotzah, is associated with the word tabitzah, which means garden. A garden is a place of pleasure and delight. In other words, we engage with others in a way of love and closeness, and obviously not the opposite, with anger. God, Hashem forbid. Indeed, as we mentioned earlier, during this gathering, the Tosfos emphasizes that the entire Talmud ends on a positive and an uplifting note.
Thank you, Carla and Diana.
You're welcome.
So Rabbi Chia has taught us how to teach the Torah. He's really showing us the way. He says, dedicate yourself to every individual, even the lowest level of learners, and do it with love and with concern. We had two Talmudic stories, and both of them emphasize the Rebbe's message, which the Rebbe said over many, many times throughout his leadership, throughout the time that he spent teaching us. And that is the vital importance of beginning Jewish education from the youngest of ages. We cannot rely on the fact or the hope that a child's going to learn Torah later on when he's already an adult. That age is, the right age is elementary school. The right time is the earliest time that a child can comprehend Torah information. Furthermore, making it available for the Jewish people is important, and it's a responsibility for everyone. It's not just the rabbis, it's not just community leaders, it's not just people of importance in inverted commas. Every single person needs to get involved in order to keep the Torah tradition going. And this all comes from our verse from right at the beginning of the parsha of the week, which was Vishinantam Levanecha Parsha Om. Right? It wasn't. It was V'nimadatem Oisom Es Benechem Ledaber Bam. You should teach them to your children, to speak of them when you sit in your house, when you go on your way, when you lie down, when you rise. And by the way, these verses, we say this every single day during the Shema. That's a quote from the Shema, as well as from our apostle. And this is the takeaway lesson from our class, from our conversation today. Each of us, we've got to find someone else, wherever it is, someone in our space, in our zone, that can do with an extra piece of Jewish flavor. We've got to give it to them. If you know Aleph, teach Aleph. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. The class is officially concluded. We'll make time for questions in a moment. If you've got to go, I understand it's 7 o'clock. So here we are.